Hello to our wonderful audience at Z Sci-Fi Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating and paying our dedicated staff to survive and create these stories for you. If you enjoy today's tale, we politely and sincerely ask that you consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment. Empires do not fall quietly. They shatter with the screams of burning planets and the deafening roar of dying stars. Yet, when the greatest biomechanical armada in the galaxy threatened to reduce humanity to ashes, the deciding factor was not a warship or a superweapon. It was a man with no rank, sitting in the heart of a collapsing Dyson sphere, who simply wanted a cup of coffee. The air inside the central command node of the Vilari Dyson sphere was not meant for human lungs. It tasted of ozone, copper, and the static discharge of a dying star. This monumental megastructure, a marvel of biomechanical engineering designed to harness the total energy output of a trapped sun, was currently in the agonizing throes of a localized collapse. Searing fractures of light spiderwebbed across the obsidian walls, while the gravity generators hummed with a sickening, out-of-phase vibration that rattled the bones of the 5 human beings trapped within. They were the diplomatic envoys of Earth, an alliance desperate for peace, now reduced to prisoners in the belly of a leviathan. All around them, rivers of luminous quantum data flowed through the semi-organic architecture, glowing with a harsh, radioactive violet hue. The atmospheric density was suffocating, choked with an electromagnetic field so thick it felt like wading through deep water. Every piece of standard human technology had died the moment the airlock sealed shut behind them. Communication links emitted only sharp hisses of static before melting into useless slag. Tactical visors shattered under the pressure of the ambient magnetic resonance. The delegation was entirely cut off, marooned in the heart of a hostile hive mind. The Vilari did not use doors. The barrier wall simply dissolved into a mist of nanites, revealing General Kalen and his elite vanguard. They were terrifying syntheses of flesh and dark metallic alloy, towering entities with multiple jointed limbs and ocular clusters that burned with the cold. Calculating light of a networked intelligence. Kalen did not possess a mouth, nor did he need one. The Vilari communicated through a unified neural web, an immense ocean of shared consciousness. When the general spoke, he did not use sound. He bypassed the auditory canals completely and drove his thoughts directly into the cerebral cortexes of the human delegation. "You are microscopic anomalies." The voice echoed inside their skulls, not as words, but as raw, physical force. It felt like a spike of ice being hammered through the backs of their eyes. Ambassador Vance, a seasoned veteran of a dozen interstellar summits, instantly collapsed to his knees, clutching his temples as blood trickled from his left nostril. Beside him, his 2 senior advisors screamed, their vocal cords straining as they writhed on the cold metallic floor. The sheer bandwidth of a hive mind attempting to interface with a singular, isolated human brain was agonizing. It was like forcing the entire ocean through a narrow pipe. "The Sol system is now a designated buffer zone," Kalen projected, the psychic weight of the command threatening to crush their minds entirely. "Humanity will surrender all orbital defense grids and planetary governance to the Vilari Collective. Resistance is a statistical impossibility. Refusal will result in the immediate and total erasure of this delegation. Consider your localized destruction a generous warning." Vance gagged, fighting through the blinding waves of agony to formulate a coherent thought. He tried to speak, to beg for a grace period, but the oppressive mental interference severed his synaptic pathways before the words could reach his tongue. The entire room was drowning in the psychic tsunami of the Vilari general, all except one. Seated at the far end of a curved, biometallic table, completely removed from the chaos unfolding a few feet away, was a man named Eric Burchett. He wore a plain, unadorned gray suit without a single medal, insignia, or identification badge. To the naked eye, he was profoundly unremarkable. To the Vylari sensors, he should have been just another fragile biological organism, writhing in pain. Yet, Eric was doing nothing of the sort. He was leaning back in his chair, completely and utterly immune to the telepathic onslaught. While the ambassador and his advisors were being psychically flayed, Eric casually rested his chin on his palm. His right hand lay flat on the table, the index finger lifting and falling in a slow, rhythmic tap against the metal. Tap, tap, tap. Behind him stood a pale, terrified combat nurse, the fifth member of the human party. She was clutching her head with one hand, but her other hand was desperately gripping a heavily shielded, analog biometric monitor strapped to Eric's wrist. The needle on the gauge, measuring his cardiovascular and neurological stress, was completely flat. Not dead, just functioning at a resting rate so impossibly calm it bordered on the unnatural. It was as if Eric was sitting in a quiet park on Earth, rather than staring down the barrel of an alien execution. Eric did not look at the towering biomechanical monstrosity that was General Kalen. He did not look at his bleeding, weeping colleagues. His eyes, devoid of any fear or urgency, were drifting aimlessly toward the massive, flickering energy core of the room, watching the violent bursts of quantum light with the mild, detached interest of a man waiting for a delayed train. The cosmic dread, the overwhelming authority of a billion interconnected alien minds, the imminent threat of obliteration. It all washed over him and simply vanished into nothing. The pressure inside the chamber shifted from a suffocating weight to a sharpened blade pressing directly against their exposed throats. General Kalen did not pace, nor did he offer the theatrical gestures of a human conqueror. He simply stood like a monument of dark alloy, his ocular clusters burning brighter as he delivered the ultimate condition of their survival. "You have 10 minutes." The psychic projection slammed into their minds, carrying the absolute certainty of a mathematical equation. 10 human minutes to transmit the planetary surrender codes. If the countdown reaches 0, our orbital defense batteries will align with your Aegis Vanguard outpost. We will incinerate the station and the 50,000 souls aboard it. The ash will serve as the ink for your signature. To demonstrate that this was not an empty threat, Kalen did something terrifying. He opened his localized network connection, bridging the minds of the human delegation to the tactical grid of the Vylari Armada, waiting just outside the Dyson sphere. In an instant, the humans felt the presence of tens of thousands of biomechanical soldiers. It was not a sound, but a psychic roar of synchronized hostility, a unified chorus of cold, mechanical hatred vibrating at a frequency that tore at the fabric of reality itself. The sheer mental force of it manifested physically within the room. The reinforced quantum glass observation windows, engineered to withstand the direct impact of solar flares, let out a piercing shriek as jagged cracks spiderwebbed across their glowing surfaces. Ambassador Vance collapsed forward, his hands smearing blood across the polished biometallic table. He was a man who had negotiated peace treaties under the threat of nuclear annihilation, but facing the abyss of a hive mind left him shattered. He forced himself to look up, his jaw trembling violently as he tried to speak through his physical vocal cords, fighting the telepathic static filling his brain. "We concede," Vance gasped out, choking on the copper taste in his mouth. "We concede the outer asteroid belts. We will grant your fleets unrestricted transit through the Jupiter corridor. We can establish a demilitarized zone spanning 5 light years. Just give us time to consult the Earth Security Council." A harsh, metallic grinding noise echoed in their heads. It took a moment for the humans to realize it was the Vylari equivalent of a sneer. You negotiate like insects bartering over a single grain of sand, while the boot descends to crush the entire colony. Kalen projected, the disdain so thick it felt like acid dripping on their brains. We do not require your permission to take the stars. We require your submission to save us the minimal energy expenditure of exterminating you. Every agonizing second ticked away, a heavy, invisible metronome beating inside their skulls. 8 minutes. 7 minutes. The tension in the room was absolute, a tightly coiled spring ready to snap and take their lives with it. Everyone, from the bleeding diplomats to the imposing Vylari guards, was entirely focused on the towering figure of General Kalen and the weeping ambassador. Because of this, no one noticed the subtle, impossible shift in thermodynamics occurring in the far corner of the room. Where Eric Burchett sat, the ambient temperature was plummeting. It was not a sudden blast of cold air, but rather a methodical erasure of heat, as if the physical laws of energy transfer were simply shutting down in his immediate vicinity. The moisture in the heavy, static-filled air began to crystallize. Microscopic fractals of frost bloomed across the lapels of Eric's unremarkable gray suit jacket. The metal table beneath his tapping finger grew dull as a thin layer of white ice spread outward from his wrist. The combat nurse standing behind him shivered violently, her breath suddenly pluming into white clouds, completely unaware that the freezing temperature was radiating directly from the man she was monitoring. 6 minutes, 5 minutes. Desperation reached its breaking point. Earth's senior security advisor, a heavily augmented veteran named Hayes, could no longer endure the slaughter of his pride. With Vance incapacitated and the clock ticking toward the murder of 50,000 people, Hayes made his move. His hand snapped downward toward a concealed holster built into his cybernetic hip, fingers wrapping around the grip of a stealth microblaster. The weapon was cloaked by a dampening field, designed to bypass any known biometric or magnetic scanner. He never even managed to draw it from the holster. The Vylari did not rely on standard scanners. They monitored the unified intent of living things. Before Hayes could pull the weapon an inch, the artificial gravity plating beneath his boots surged with a localized spike of devastating force. The air above him hardened into a solid block of kinetic pressure. Hayes was instantly hammered, face first into the floor, with the weight of a small transport vehicle. His cybernetic enhancements whined and sparked under the strain. His collarbone snapped with a sickening crunch that echoed loudly in the silent room. He lay there, pinned helplessly to the deck, gasping for air as a Vylari guard casually aimed a plasma projector directly at the back of his skull. Total, inescapable deadlock. 4 minutes. The countdown was a relentless march toward execution. Then, the clock hit exactly 3 minutes. On the center of the table, the delegation's primary encrypted holopad, which had been dead since they entered the room, suddenly flickered. A stream of fragmented, nonsensical red text crawled across the cracked screen before emitting a sharp, discordant error chime. In the suffocating, terror-filled silence of the chamber, Eric Burchett stopped tapping his finger. He looked away from the flickering energy core, lowered his gaze to the frozen table, and let out a very soft, drawn-out sigh. It was a quiet sound, utterly devoid of fear, but in a room paralyzed by the overwhelming psychic presence of an alien god. That single, human sigh cut through the tension like a scalpel slicing through taut canvas. Time itself seemed to stretch, elongating every agonizing heartbeat into a drawn-out, hollow drum strike. The frantic pace of the countdown and the suffocating psychic storm raging through the chamber did not dissipate. But the atmosphere underwent a drastic, unnatural shift. It was as if the universe had slammed on the brakes. To Eric Burchett, the apocalyptic pressure simply did not matter. While the highest-ranking officials of Earth were paralyzed by telepathic agony and pinned by localized gravity fields, The man in the unadorned gray suit moved. He slowly lifted his head. His movements were fluid and deliberately unhurried, completely unhindered by the crushing atmospheric density that had driven an augmented security advisor into the floor plates. He turned his gaze upward, bypassing the imposing biomechanical guards, and looked directly into the burning, multifaceted ocular clusters of General Kalen. The alien commander contained the processing power of 1 billion networked minds, representing a vast ocean of calculating cruelty and absolute certainty. Yet, when those glowing optics met Eric's eyes, the hive mind found a terrifying void. There was no terror. There was no desperate calculation for survival. There was just a profound, impenetrable stillness that absorbed the alien glare without reflecting anything back. Eric did not address the warlord, holding the fate of 50,000 human lives in his grasp. He did not offer a counter-proposal, nor did he plead for mercy. Instead, he shifted his attention completely away from the apex predator of the galaxy. He looked down at the junior communications specialist, a young man currently huddled on the freezing floor plates, weeping quietly as blood leaked from his ears. "Bring me my coffee," Eric said. His voice was not loud. It was warm, steady, and entirely conversational. Yet, in that chamber of horrors, those 5 mundane words landed with the destructive force of a kinetic bombardment. The sheer, unfathomable absurdity of the request triggered something unprecedented within the Vailari collective. A deathly, absolute silence crashed down upon the room. The glowing rivers of violet quantum data flowing through the biometallic walls suddenly stuttered, flickering off beat for a fraction of a second. General Kalen physically froze mid-stance. The biomechanical tyrant, linked to an armada of perfect war machines, experienced a profound systemic halt. The hive mind's predictive algorithms could not process the data input. It was an anomaly that defied every established metric of biological response to extreme threat. A critical logic error bloomed like a virus within the network. The interconnected intelligence spiraled into an endless loop of analysis. Why was the prey asking for a heated beverage while the executioner held the blade to its throat? On the floor, the young communications soldier blinked through his tears, completely bewildered. The crushing telepathic weight pressing his face into the deck had momentarily stalled, disrupted by the general's sudden processing failure. Driven by ingrained military discipline and a desperate need to cling to any semblance of human normalcy, the young man forced himself to move. His limbs trembled violently against the residual gravitational pressure. He dragged his heavy, specialized equipment case closer, his freezing fingers fumbling with the reinforced latches. The metallic clicks of the case opening sounded like cannon fire in the dead quiet room. He pulled out a heavy-duty, vacuum-sealed thermal flask and a plain, thick-walled porcelain mug. With agonizing slowness, his arms shaking from exhaustion and terror, the soldier unscrewed the cap and tilted the flask. Every drop of the pitch-black liquid tumbling from the lip of the flask seemed to hang in the air, catching the hostile violet light of the alien command center before hitting the bottom of the mug. The sound of the pouring liquid was the only noise left in the universe. The rich, earthy aroma of roasted beans wafted upward, a jarringly familiar scent that clashed violently with the smell of ozone and dying technology. The soldier pushed himself up onto one knee and offered the cup forward. Eric extended his bare hand to receive it. The exact millisecond his index finger made contact with the warm porcelain, a sound echoed through the chamber. It was not a physical noise, but an imperceptible crack that resonated in the very fabric of the space around them. It was the sound of a paradigm shattering. Instantly, the suffocating psychic pressure inside the minds of the human delegation evaporated. The blinding pain behind Ambassador Vance's eyes vanished, leaving only a dull, throbbing ache. The artificial gravity field pinning the security advisor to the deck dissolved into nothingness. allowing him to draw a full, desperate breath into his bruised lungs. The terrifying hum of the alien armada waiting outside was severed from their consciousness, replaced by the blessed, empty quiet of their own isolated minds. They did not understand what had just happened. They did not comprehend the physics or the biology of the sudden reprieve. But primal instinct, honed over millions of years of evolution, took over. Without speaking a single word, the bleeding diplomats, the injured security officer, and the terrified combat nurse all scrambled backward. They dragged themselves across the floor, moving away from the towering Vylari guards and clustering together directly behind the chair of the unremarkable man in the gray suit. They huddled in his shadow, instinctively recognizing that the small patch of freezing space around Eric Burchett was the only safe harbor left in a collapsing world. To understand the magnitude of the fracture that had just occurred, one must perceive the universe through the sensory apparatus of General Kalen. For 3 centuries, his consciousness had never been confined to a single physical shell. To be Vylari was to exist as a sprawling, decentralized intelligence, a symphony of billions of interconnected minds operating in perfect, zero-latency unison. His visual interface did not merely see light and shadow. It processed the emotional states, tactical calculations, and sensory inputs of an entire armada through quantum entanglement. He was the ocean, and every soldier was a drop of water within him. Suddenly, the ocean began to drain. Deep within Kalen's cognitive architecture, a catastrophic systemic failure cascaded across his diagnostic overlays. The soothing, omnipresent hum of the fleet stationed outside the megastructure, a chorus of tens of thousands of synchronized voices, abruptly became muffled. The crisp, instantaneous transmission of data packets degraded into sluggish, corrupted fragments. Across his internal heads-up display, the standard violet indicators of optimal network health violently shifted to a glaring, abrasive crimson. A series of critical alerts flooded his visual cortex. Network integrity failing. Synaptic latency exceeding acceptable parameters. Entanglement tether severing. Kalen's ocular clusters whirred, the mechanical apertures dilating as he desperately sought the source of the localized interference. His multi-spectrum sensors swept past the cowering human diplomats, dismissing their panicked biological rhythms as irrelevant noise. The focal point of the massive quantum disruption was anchored entirely to the unremarkable man in the gray suit holding the ceramic mug. The general commanded his internal subroutines to execute a deep tissue, neurokinetic scan of Eric Burchett. The biomechanical sensors pierced through the human's clothing, flesh, and bone, mapping the electromagnetic topography of his nervous system. What the scan returned was not just an anomaly. It was a biological impossibility that shattered the foundational laws of Vylari science. Every living organism in the known galaxy possessed a psychic footprint. Even a single-celled amoeba emitted a faint, quantifiable hum of localized energy. A standard human brain appeared on Vylari sensors as a bright, chaotic constellation of electrical storms, alpha, beta, theta, and gamma waves continuously firing. But when the sensors swept over Eric's cerebral cortex, they registered absolute, terrifying nothingness. There were no brain waves. There was no synaptic resonance. There was no psychic footprint. He was not shielding his mind with advanced technology, nor was he suppressing his thoughts through meditation. He was a gaping, infinite void in the quantum fabric of the universe. To the hive mind's visual spectrum, Eric Burchett was a walking, breathing black hole. He was a psychic null zone, an organism that actively consumed and annihilated telepathic energy simply by existing, and the phenomenon was accelerating. Through his analytical overlay, Kalen watched the thermal and chemical interactions occurring within the human's digestive tract. The dark liquid in the cup was not a ceremonial libation, nor was it a psychological crutch to soothe the nerves. It was a highly specific, Earth-grown chemical catalyst. As the liquid passed Eric's lips, the biological sensors tracked the absorption of a complex alkaloid compound directly into his bloodstream. To a normal human, the caffeine would simply bind to adenosine receptors, warding off fatigue and increasing alertness. But Eric's physiology was a genetic aberration of apocalyptic proportions. As the caffeine saturated his circulatory system, it acted as a hyperaccelerant. It interacted with the mutated cellular structure of his nervous system, radically amplifying the natural nullification field generated by his body. His heart rate, which had remained impossibly flat, now served as a rhythmic pump, distributing the chemical trigger and pushing the invisible dead zone outward with every beat. Eric took a slow, deliberate sip. Instantly, the radius of absolute quantum silence expanded by 3 meters. The invisible wave of nullification washed over the biometallic table, freezing the ambient temperature further. Where the boundary of the dead zone touched the walls of the command center, the glowing rivers of violet data instantly turned a dead, ashen gray. The semi-organic architecture began to necrotize, starved of the psychic energy required to sustain its functions. Kalen felt a horrifying sensation he had never experienced in his long, conquering existence. He felt cold. The connection to his external guard units, positioned just outside the null radius, snapped completely. He was being isolated, amputated from the collective consciousness that defined his very soul. Desperation, a primitive emotion long purged from the Vylari genetic code, flared to life within the general. He sent a frantic, localized, hardwired pulse to his elite vanguard inside the room, bypassing the crippled wireless network. Execute the anomaly. The towering, armored guards reacted with lethal precision. They pivoted their massive frames, raising heavy plasma projectors mounted on their forearms, aiming the glowing muzzles directly at the center of Eric's chest. They locked their targets. They willed the weapons to fire. Nothing happened. The Vylari war machines were pinnacles of ergonomic destruction. They did not rely on primitive mechanical triggers or physical buttons. Their weaponry was an extension of their own bodies, activated purely by localized neural impulses. A thought was supposed to become a beam of incandescent death in less than 1/100th of a second. But the guards were standing 6 meters away, entirely submerged within the expanding radius of Eric's bioelectric void. The moment their brains generated the command to fire, the neural impulse hit the dead zone and vanished into nothing. The signal could not travel from their cerebral processors to the firing mechanisms on their arms. The quantum pathways were gone. The terrifying, world-burning plasma projectors were now nothing more than useless. Heavy lumps of dead metal attached to their wrists. The guards stood frozen, trapped in a state of cognitive paralysis. They were pulling the trigger in their minds over and over again, shouting silently into a void that swallowed their intent without a trace. Panic, raw and unfiltered, began to bleed through the remnants of their localized network. They were elite killers, bred for absolute supremacy, and they had just been disarmed by a fundamental law of physics they could not comprehend. In the center of the suffocating silence, surrounded by the towering statues of paralyzed alien conquerors and the terrified remnants of his own diplomatic delegation, Eric Burchett remained the calmest entity in the sector. He did not gloat. He did not issue a counter-threat. He simply sat back in his chair, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and took another long, appreciative sip from the thick porcelain mug. He let the hot liquid rest on his tongue, savoring the robust, dark roasted flavor, entirely unbothered by the fact that with every drop he consumed, he was plunging the most feared empire in the galaxy into the Dark Ages. The towering commander of the Vylari vanguard physically staggered. His massive biomechanical frame listed heavily to one side, his heavily armored foot slamming into the deck plates to prevent a total collapse. It was as if he had been struck by the broadside of an invisible dreadnought. For 300 years, General Kalen had existed as a multitude. He had never known a single fraction of a second of solitary existence. From the moment he was forged in the Genesis vats, he was the vanguard, he was the fleet, he was the central intelligence, and he was the planetary governor, all functioning at once. To be Vailari was to be an unending, glorious chorus of billions of minds operating in perfect unison. Now, that magnificent chorus was gone. In its place was a terrifying, suffocating vacuum. It was an isolation so profound, so agonizingly absolute, that it felt as though his very soul had been violently flayed from his synthetic bones. He was completely blind, entirely deaf to the comforting symphony of his entire species. The vast, limitless ocean of shared thought had evaporated into nothingness, leaving him stranded on a barren, lightless rock of individual consciousness. This was the ultimate horror for a creature of the collective. It was a terror far worse than physical pain. It was the crushing, suffocating weight of total loneliness. He could only hear the mechanical whirring of his own internal servos and the rapid, panicked cycling of his primary fluid pumps. For the first time in 3 centuries, he was entirely alone. Stripped of his telepathic majesty and reduced to the humiliating, claustrophobic confines of a single biological shell, Kalen experienced a total systemic breakdown of Vailari military doctrine. Among his highly advanced kind, utilizing physical sound waves to communicate was considered an archaic, deeply degrading practice. It was a crude method reserved exclusively for interacting with lower, unevolved life forms like livestock or feral beasts. Yet, driven by the primal, unfiltered terror of the absolute void, Kalen bypassed centuries of genetic conditioning. Deep within his armored throat, synthetic vocal cords that had remained dormant since his creation were violently engaged. The physical exertion required to push air through those unused biological mechanisms was immense. The sound that tore from him was a jagged, grating rasp, a horrifying amalgamation of grinding metallic gears and the desperate roar of a dying predator. "What kind of heretical weapon are you?" he roared aloud, the harsh, unnatural syllables echoing brutally against the dying, necrotizing walls of the command chamber. The man in the plain gray suit did not flinch at the booming, mechanical roar. He did not recoil from the towering alien warlord, nor did he rush to justify his existence or gloat over the sudden, catastrophic downfall of his enemy. Instead, Eric Burchett exhibited a deliberate, agonizingly slow precision that commanded the entire room. He lowered his hand and placed the half-empty porcelain mug onto the dull surface of the frozen metal table. The sharp, singular clack of the ceramic base making contact with the frozen metal rang out with devastating clarity. In the dead, breathless silence of the ruined command center, that small, entirely mundane sound did not register as a simple clink of dishware. It resonated exactly like the heavy wooden gavel of a supreme judge slamming down onto a sounding block to deliver a terminal, irreversible sentence. The immense power dynamic within the room had entirely inverted in the span of a single breath. The undisputed apex predator of the cosmos was now trembling on his feet, while the previously insignificant human dictated the fundamental terms of reality. Eric folded his hands neatly on his lap, looking up at the staggering giant. When he finally spoke his first complete sentence to the Vailari commander, his voice remained entirely devoid of malice, triumph, arrogance, or anger. It was merely the cold, unyielding delivery of an absolute cosmic fact. "You thought we sent diplomats here to negotiate for our survival," Eric stated cleanly, his deep voice hanging heavy in the freezing, crystallized air. He tilted his head slightly, his perfectly calm gaze piercing through the terrifying, multi-eyed armor directly into the fractured, terrified consciousness of the alien general. "You were wrong. They are here to negotiate for yours." Behind him, Ambassador Vance and the rest of the Earth delegation remained huddled tightly in the protective shadow of his psychic dead zone. They were breathless and wide-eyed, finally understanding the true, terrifying nature of their mysterious escort. Eric remained perfectly still, a calm monolith at the center of the galactic storm. He systematically elaborated on the reality of their situation, peeling back the final layer of humanity's grand deception. When our shuttle docked, your security grid scanned our vessel and found no conventional armaments. You found no explosive ordnance, no kinetic penetrators, and no directed energy weapons. You assumed we were completely helpless, lambs marching willingly to the slaughter. You failed to realize that the Earth Security Council did not need to arm this delegation because I am a perpetual, biological electromagnetic pulse bomb. Eric let the immense weight of the words sink deeply into the isolated, frantic mind of the general. My central nervous system is a localized quantum singularity, but it is currently heavily restrained. It is tethered directly to my autonomic biological functions. If my resting heart rate exceeds a specific, closely monitored threshold, or if I am terminated by your guards, the biological containment field instantly collapses. The resulting quantum shockwave will not just shut down the systems aboard this localized station. It will permanently wipe clean the entire Velari hive mind network within a radius of 100 light-years. Every starship, every planetary defense grid, every command node, and every single interconnected consciousness in that vast expanse will instantly suffer total synaptic erasure. Your species will not simply lose communication. You will lose your minds. You will be reduced to hollow, breathing statues. It was a mutually assured destruction protocol, wrapped in unassuming human skin. It was a doomsday device, triggered by fear or death, currently kept docile only by a man who possessed absolute, terrifying control over his own physiology and neurochemistry. To punctuate his declaration, Eric slowly reached forward once again. His pale fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of the porcelain mug. The ambient air temperature seemed to drop another degree. He lifted the cup from the table, bringing the dark, steaming liquid back up toward his lips in a smooth, unhurried motion. He paused, holding the vessel mere inches from his mouth, his eyes locked dead onto the glowing, terrified optics of General Kalen. "One more sip," Eric said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant whisper that filled every corner of the freezing chamber. "One more sip, and your invincible fleet outside this sphere will become deaf and dumb machines floating endlessly in the dark space." The Velari commander, driven by the agonizing pride of a centuries-old conqueror, chose the path of mutually assured annihilation, bypassing his paralyzed vanguard and the expanding dead zone. Kalen attempted to route a localized, delayed suicide command through a submerged, heavily shielded subnetwork deep beneath the floor plates. His target was a heavy dreadnought stationed on the fringes of the orbital sphere. The command was simple: plunge into the human outpost, ram the station, turn 50,000 human lives into cosmic dust. A secondary array of crimson lights flared to life across the general's scorched visual interface, signaling the successful transmission of the final, desperate order. Eric Burchett did not wait for the confirmation. He saw the subtle, chaotic twitch in the giant's ocular clusters. He recognized the defiance of a dying empire. Without a single word, Eric lifted the heavy porcelain mug and swallowed the entire remaining volume of the dark liquid in one swift, unbroken motion. The reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The biological catalyst flooded his bloodstream, pushing his cardiovascular system into overdrive and expanding the quantum nullification field to its absolute maximum threshold. The invisible shockwave blasted outward, moving faster than the speed of light, completely swallowing the command center, the entire Dyson sphere, and the vast expanse of space surrounding it. General Kalen did not simply stagger this time. He collapsed violently. The massive, biomechanical tyrant, crashed onto the frozen metal deck, his armored hands desperately clawing at his own cranial plating. A horrifying, mechanical scream tore from his throat as the final, absolute thread connecting him to his species was violently severed. It was total, irreversible silence. Outside the megastructure, the terrifying Velari armada met its end. Tens of thousands of sleek, predatory warships, poised to scorch the earth, simply died in the dark. Their propulsion drives sputtered and went cold. Their weapon arrays powered down. The mines piloting them were instantly wiped clean, leaving behind an entire fleet of dead, floating iron statues suspended helplessly in the vacuum of space. The invincible hive mind was fundamentally broken. Laying on the floor, gasping for air he did not truly need, Kalen stared at the absolute destruction of his reality. He realized the human was not bluffing. The complete extinction of the Vilari consciousness was merely one heartbeat away. Trembling violently, the broken general raised his massive hand to his chest plate. With a sickening crunch of tearing metal, he ripped off his intricately forged command insignia, the ultimate symbol of his authority and his species' dominance. He threw the heavy piece of metal onto the floor. It skittered across the ice, coming to a halt at the tip of Eric's shoe. It was the highest form of surrender, an absolute, unconditional withdrawal. The cosmic dread that had choked the room vanished. The human delegation, acting with cold, practiced military precision, stood up from the floor. No one cheered. No one offered a gloating smile. Ambassador Vance adjusted his collar, wiped the dried blood from his face, and began neatly packing his physical documents back into his encrypted briefcase. They moved in rhythmic, synchronized silence, exhibiting the quiet efficiency of professionals finishing a deeply unpleasant task. Hours later, aboard the sterile, humming interior of an earthbound stealth shuttle, the adrenaline finally began to fade. The head of the diplomatic delegation sat heavily in his crash couch, wiping a fresh layer of cold sweat from his forehead. He looked across the narrow cabin. Eric stood by the reinforced viewport, gazing out at the endless expanse of the cosmos, looking as unremarkable as ever. He held a simple paper cup of water in his hand. The ambassador swallowed hard, breaking the long silence. "Who are you really in high command?" he asked softly, his voice trembling slightly. Eric turned his head, a faint ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. He casually tossed the empty paper cup into the automated recycling bin. "They do not pin star ranks on the thing used to end the war," Eric replied, his tone perfectly even and profoundly empty. "They only attach warning labels." The scene faded to the cold, blue light of a classified terminal belonging to the Earth Security Council. Text scrolled across the screen in stark, white lettering. Operation Brew Coffee. Personnel: Eric Burchett. Rank: Strategic Deterrent Weapon. Level Omega. Status: Cleared the Vilari system. Note: Ensure the supply of whole bean roasted coffee on all diplomatic fleets. Thank you so much to our wonderful audience for listening to today's story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below. If you found today's story captivating, we sincerely and politely ask that you consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the description or the comment section. Your generous support provides the necessary budget to pay our hardworking staff, allowing them to provide for their families and continue creating even better stories for you. Thank you, and see you in the next adventure.